Hey everybody, in this video we're going to talk about what your annotated bibliography can look like. Right now I have the assignment description pulled up, and we're going to look at this before moving on to another annotated bibliography. This annotated bibliography, as you'll see, isn't exactly what you will be doing for this class. Rather, it's a bibliography I made for a course about a year and a half ago in a graduate seminar here at UB. That being said, although the goals for that assignment were a little different, I think you'll notice several parallels. And while I'm also not showing you this bibliography as an example of um, something that you should emulate to a T, I think what it does with the individual bibliography entries, as well as with its introductory sections, can really get you started in thinking about what your bibliography should look like and how you can begin framing your research. So this is the bibliography that I created for that class a few years ago. It was for a class on pedagogy. And for those of you who don't know, pedagogy is basically the study of teaching or the philosophy of teaching. And for this assignment, I was tasked with approaching a pedagogical problem or issue, and then, as you guys are doing, researching for it as if I were going to write in a research paper without actually writing the paper. So instead, I just present the problem and then my sources. So what you see here has three sections. And again, these are different sections than the ones you guys will have for your assignment. Um, but while you're supposed to have an introduction, essentially, then your bibliography, and then a conclusion, um, my annotated bibliography is a little different. There is an introduction, and in a sense, there is a conclusion, but I don't present them in the same 1, 2, 3 order. Rather, it's more like 1, 3, 2. So section 1 here, process, is a section in which I talk about how I came to this idea and also my methodology for the production of the bibliography, how I came to my research questions and how they developed. Um, and then this section, after the fact, a further explanation, is similar to what your conclusion might be. Um, in it, I talk about what the research process was like, and maybe how my questions changed. And then down here, section 3 is just the bibliography itself, where I have all of these sources and entries. Let's look at the directions for the introduction. In the assignment description, it says, for this portion of the assignment, you will, in academic and polished prose, briefly introduce your topic of choice, discuss your reason for choosing it, and outline its importance to the broader medical community. What is, or why is it important to research it, and why research it now? So let's look at my introduction here. Um, I begin sort of self-aware, talking about how I came to this topic and hoping to find a way to make the topic overlap with my research interests, which really aren't about pedagogy at all. Rather, my interests as a researcher are generally about 20th century art, specifically experimental arts and the so-called avant-gardes. And one of the questions that fascinated me when looking into this and thinking about pedagogy is how these avant-garde art movements are often thought of as schools, sometimes actually having real schools or manifesting in real schools, right? So for those of you who have studied art history at all, or even have a passing interest in it, you may recall that it's generally in the 20th century, especially, composed of all of these different schools. Dadaism, Surrealism, Impressionism, etc. And so I'm looking at that, and that's the germinal question here. How can the school of uh, the avant-garde art movement be thought of in terms of pedagogy? And how can these avant-garde art movements and their ideas that aren't necessarily pedagogical in an explicit sense help me understand new ways of teaching that are maybe themselves a little more experimental. Um, and so here I focus a little more. So if that was my original question, well, how do you move on from something that broad? Well, in this paragraph, I talk about how I'm mostly going to look at this school called Black Mountain College, which is in Asheville, North Carolina. It was really short-lived. The campus still exists, but it's fairly legendary, and a lot of prominent 20th century artists and writers were there. Um, and so I'm using that because, again, it's an actual school that is also thought of as a quote unquote artistic school. And I'm trying to look at how they taught, how they approached teaching. And so I'm saying that I'm using them as sort of a launching pad to really follow the threads of their connections in order to focus my research. Um, and in this paragraph here, I talk about how where that led me, right? So quickly, I'm not even in Black Mountain anymore. I'm learning about other things that are only tangentially related. I'm mostly focusing on John Cage, but that leads me to people like Deleuze or Ezra Pound. Um, and then here I begin talking about Paulo Freire, um, who I note is a sort of theoretical touchstone for the bibliography. Um, and I ask a few more questions, right, that are all related to this broader topic. How can critical pedagogy be seen as actually avant-garde, um, as experimental, as forward pushing, as generative, rather than just a study of how to teach, right? Um, we can now look at the um, conclusion, which, as I said, is the second section. Um, and in this conclusion, I note, like in your conclusion, that some things have changed. I write, having written the previous section in the first half of the research and annotation process, I now write this section having finished the annotations. Appropriate to its content, the bibliography remains in flux. Despite my initial ambitions, you won't find anything here about Rauschenberg or Buckminster Fuller. Um, so again, I had certain ideas when I went in, but after I did the research, things sort of changed. The research led me to different areas than I initially expected. Um, and I didn't even focus much on Black Mountain, right? Because there's not much there. Uh, Instead, my focus was mostly on John Cage, who taught at Black Mountain, and his pedagogy, which led me to the language poets, a group of poets who take a lot of influence from him, and I was looking at their pedagogy, and also sort of histories of them teaching. Uh, a lot of these poets became professors at colleges, such as the University of Buffalo. Um, then I go on here, you can read all of this. But if we look at the bibliography itself, right, these entries might be a little longer than your entries might be, and that's okay. Um, but let's look at one of them and what I do with it. Let's start here. So you'll notice I have the entry itself, right? Freire Apollo, chapter 2. It follows MLA, whatever. But then I start to talk about it. And in addition to summarizing this, one thing you're going to notice and that I'd like to see you emulate is how I'm connecting it to other sources. See here, I'm explicitly connecting Paulo Freire to John Cage. So summarizing some of his ideas and saying how they're Cagean in some ways. Similarly, I reference Deleuze, who is another entry of mine here. So I'm making connections between the texts and talking about how each of them affects my understanding of others. Um, Now, for your bibliography, you're going to have subheadings and three individual sections. That's something I didn't do here for this bibliography, simply because it wasn't required. Um, but I think if you look at how throughout all of these entries, I'm connecting one source to another, and connecting each source to the overall ideas that I outline in the first section, you may begin to develop a stronger idea of how to actually uh, organize your sources in terms of these three sections. One thing I want to point out is that the formatting is a little messed up here occasionally, and that's because I just downloaded it as a PDF, and sometimes that happens. So, like when you see this right here, um, don't model your annotated bibliography after that, right? But overall, I just wanted to talk about this, and if you have any questions for me, please feel free to email me.